Okay, I've got a great show for you today. We're going to be going through just the major news stories and helping you make sense of all of those. To help me do that, I have with me today Steve Hilton. Steve, thank you so much for coming on.
It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Just as an introduction, most people might recognize your face as a contributor on Fox News, but you
Yeah.
now have your own podcast show, the Steve Hilton Show, and we'll make sure to leave a link to that. But I appreciate you coming on. I want to jump right into some national stories, a few that relate to California where you are, and then I want to jump over to Russia. You've been following this, I'm sure, but want to get your take on this 300 plus page report coming out from special counsel Robert Hur saying that Joe Biden is a weak and poor memoried man who cannot be put in front of a jury because he's incapable of being a credible witness. What are your thoughts on this, and why would a man with this classification be the front runner for the entire Democrat Party?
You know, it's absolutely amazing. So the thing that this makes me think is something I've been saying, for a while as I've been commenting on Fox and elsewhere and on my show about Biden's precipitous decline. I mean, we all see it, right? We see that things that we used to call gaffes, oh, Joe Biden's gaffes, they're not gaffes. They're the very obvious evidence of someone who's really rapidly deteriorating in terms of his mental capabilities, his cognitive skills, whatever term you want to use. And we're not doctors, and so we're not going to diagnose everything. But senility, being senile, is not a medical term. It is a term that you can apply to someone who is suffering the effects of old age, which he obviously is. Now, all along, as this has been going on, and so apparent to all of us, a line that I've used the whole time is, wow, if this is what he's like in public, when he knows that the cameras are on him and the world is watching him, imagine what it's like in private. Well, now we don't need to imagine. That's what the Hur report provided for us. It gave us a glimpse into what he's really like in private. And this is what's so worrying about all this. Never mind, him being the candidate for the office of president for another 4 years. Right now, when he's sitting there, and this is what I've been saying the whole time. Imagine him in meetings, trying to make decisions, trying to advance the interests of the United States. It's just inconceivable. If in public he can barely keep it together, what on earth must he be like in private? And now we know he is an elderly man with a poor memory. Now, that is an absolutely terrifying indictment of the person that's supposed to be leading the country. And here's the final point I'd make before we get into a conversation about it. It's particularly egregious and terrifying if you think about the areas of policy that are particularly in the president's hands. So, we obviously have our constitution and we have checks and balances, and the Congress is in charge of spending money and passing legislation, and the executive branch headed by the president in charge of implementing legislation. They're tussling around about that. That's all, we know that. But there's one area of policy where the president has really free reign, and that is foreign policy, security policy, overseas policy. And that's the area of policy, if you think about the last 3.5 years or so, that's been the most disastrous of all the disasters of the Biden administration. It's the foreign policy that's been particularly bad. And when you think about Afghanistan and the appeasement of Putin over the pipeline right at the beginning, and then of course Iran, and all the just appalling series of misjudgments on foreign policy that have created the most dangerous and unstable world that many commentators are saying, the world's more dangerous than it's been since the 1930s. That is the direct result of American weakness, and that is the direct result of a weak leader at the top.
Yeah. I mean, I know as I've studied history, I know that we've covered for presidents in the past. For example, you and I are aware of the fact that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in a wheelchair while he was
Yes.
president. They covered that up. Most of the American people did not know that. We've now learned that JFK was being injected with amphetamines for his energy and his back problems. We know that for Trump, they covered the fact that he drank like 19 Diet Cokes a day and loves McDonald's, but somebody having mental incapacity that controls the nuclear football, that's in
Yeah.
control of a military that seems hell-bent on causing chaos around the world, foreign policy. I mean, look at Vladimir Putin. He just came out within the last 24 hours and said it would be to Russia's benefit to have Joe Biden stay in place. Well, of course it would. You
Of
can
course.
continue to support Iran and you can continue to kill people in Ukraine. But for me, my gosh, I can't believe, I mean, supposedly Joe Biden got 81 million votes, and you're telling me out of those 81 million people, there's not somebody better than him to run the country?
Well, I mean, well, actually, I mean, to be, blunt about it, it's clear that he isn't. I mean, that's the really sort of terrible thing about this, especially when you think about the endless lectures that we get from the left and the media about our democracy, our democracy. We're in a situation which is the opposite of what the system should be, where the guy at the top clearly isn't in charge. I mean, he clearly isn't capable of maintaining the pace and control you need to certainly manage our role in the world. And so, what does that mean? That means someone else is doing it. All the people around him, the national security team, and so on. And then who are they? They're all the people from the Obama administration, people like Jake Sullivan and Antony Blinken. They've been around for years, and they are absolutely part of the foreign policy establishment in Washington. And the whole point of electing people through elections is to stop the permanent bureaucracy from having its way and pushing its own agenda, and to have the will of the people represented there. And so when you've got someone who's the leader, who's obviously not capable of being in charge, that is the space into which the bureaucracy, the whatever you want to call it, the administrative state, the deep state, all the rest of it, that they come and occupy that space because the political leadership isn't there. That is totally alien to what the whole Constitution is supposed to be about.
Yeah. Do you think then that when we get to the DNC convention this summer, that he's going to get his delegates that he legally has the right to, and then assign those to somebody else like Gavin Newsom or
Yeah.
Dave Phillips or somebody?
I don't think that he will, in that sense, pick someone. But the scenario of a new candidate emerging from the convention, which I thought was very, very unlikely, now I think is, I would say, more likely than not. I think the specific scenario would be that, prior to the convention, I don't know, like just shortly before the convention, so that it's a done deal, as it were, he announces he's not running again, and then frees the delegates, says, look, vote however you want to vote. And then there's basically a contest at the convention, which, would be dramatic and interesting and so on. And I do think that Gavin Newsom would be the one who would win such a contest, because in the end, the Democrats, their number one priority would be winning the election. And it seems to me that there's really no question that of the available conceivable candidates right now, Gavin Newsom is easily the strongest. So I think that is actually quite a probable outcome. But what you have to set against that is the incredible vanity and narcissism of Joe Biden. And so this is something that I think is just underappreciated. Like, look at this guy. I mean, there's two stories that I learned from an amazing book I read called What It Takes, which was a book about the 1988 presidential primary. Amazing book. And it's like almost like a mini biography of the six candidates, two on the Republican side, Bob Dole and the first President Bush. And on the Democrat side, you had Gary Hart, Mike Dukakis, Dick Gephardt, and Joe Biden. And it was just fascinating to learn about Joe Biden. There's just two stories I'll give you from that book that tell you a lot. One, when Joe Biden was, I think, like in his 20s, like this is the early 1960s, mid 1960s, and he was dating his first wife, the one who died tragically in that car accident in Delaware. She took him home for the first time. But the first time she took him home to meet her parents, they were chatting, and they said, as you do to the new boyfriend, so what are you doing? What are you planning to do with your life? He says, I'm going to be president. And they say, president of what? He says, president of the United States. So like this guy's been, to imagine saying that at that age, that's pretty kind of, demented in a particular way. So, he spent his entire life trying to achieve that goal. He's not going to be, give it up voluntarily. And then the second story in that book I thought was fascinating in 1988, which was, of course, the election where Biden ran for president in the primary and then withdrew because of the plagiarism, the stories of plagiarism that emerged. And it wasn't just one, like it obviously was a pattern. So more and more stories were coming out, and the advisors would just concluded, look, you got to pull out. It's not sustainable. You just do it gracefully. You can run another time. And the one person that was saying to him, don't pull out. You got to keep fighting. Stay in the race. Jill Biden. So these are two people, Joe and Jill, who, I don't think it's going to be easy to persuade them that he should back out. So I still think it's not, sir. Before the events of last week, I would have said very unlikely. I think Biden's going to be the candidate. He wants to do it. He's incredibly vain. He thinks he's the only guy that can beat Trump. He's saving the nation and the world. That's his self-image. And so he's going to stick with it, and Jill will support him. Now, I don't know. It's such a obvious disaster for him. And of course, that press conference after the report came out made it so much worse. It feels like the whole mood around this topic has changed. So I think it's more likely he will go. But still, in the end, it's hard to force him out. If he wants to stay, it's very difficult to force him.
Yeah, especially where they don't really have a lot of great candidates in the wings. I agree with you that Gavin Newsom, he's smart, he's handsome, he's got the money, he's got the experience. But is he good? Would he be good? Would California Democrat politics roll out to the whole nation and be a good thing? That I don't know that I can say yes to, and that's the record that he would have to run on.
Well, the California is a disaster policy-wise. I mean, I live here. I'm now focused on it. I've set up a policy organization, Golden Together, which, we're just starting to publish, a set of policy arguments and ideas for how we turn things around in California. But there's a simple way of capturing just how badly off the rails things have gotten in California. And remember, it's been a one-party state. The last time a Republican won an election statewide was 2006. And of course, just as at the federal level, a lot of the legislation actually comes from the legislature, obviously. So a lot of the bad stuff is not Gavin Newsom directly, but the legislature. Of course, he signs it, and he has a lot of influence and power over the legislature, which he uses. Well, we'll get to that in a second. But if you just look at the raw numbers in the California legislature, there are Democratic supermajorities. In the state assembly, you have 62 Democrats, 18 Republicans. In the state Senate, 32 Democrats, 8 Republicans. So it's like all Democrat. And what's the result of all of this? On every single major issue, California is now literally the worst in the country. Not nearly the worst, the actual worst. I mean, one way I put it is, as I go around California, campaigning for change, it's like we're the top of every list that you want to be the bottom of, and the bottom of every list you want to be the top of. So, for example, we have the highest taxes in the country, but the worst poverty, the worst poverty rate. We spend the most per student in the public schools. We have the lowest literacy. We have the highest housing costs and the lowest home ownership. Again, these are all 50 out of 50, not 42nd out of 50 or whatever. We have the highest rate of robberies. We have the worst business climate, 50th out of 50, on and on. It's a disaster policy-wise, an absolute disaster. So to be fair, that is not all Gavin Newsom's fault, but he's been in power in California continuously for a long time. Mayor of San Francisco, lieutenant governor for 8 years, governor now for 5. And so, it's you're right. It's difficult to avoid responsibility and accountability. I mean, obviously, you've got the visible evidence of failure, the homelessness across the state, and the crime, and so on. Not all the fault of one person, but what I would say is that the ideology, the extremist far left ideology that has created all this, he has not. I just want to be fair, and I know him a little bit. I don't think he is a far left Democrat himself. But what I think the reasonable criticism would be, he didn't stand up to it. He allowed it to happen. I think actually he is personally more of a pragmatic politician. That's actually why I think he'll do better on the national stage than in California, because his instincts, I think, are more centrist. But I would argue that in California, he hasn't stood up to the far left. And so as a result, we've had these terrible policies with the catastrophic results that I just mentioned.
Yeah. I had conservative talk radio host Michael Savage on my show, and I was shocked to hear he said something very similar. He said that he's known Gavin Newsom for decades, and it's actually the legislature that runs California that has
Yeah,
become so crooked and corrupt and woke that he's really hamstringed by a lot of that. I'll give you an example. I don't know if you saw this or not, but Representative Barbara Lee over
yeah,
Oakland, San Francisco area, she just came out and said, we absolutely have to move minimum wage to
yes,
$50 an hour. Now,
I
when
know.
you do the math, Steve, that's over $100,000 a year. So teenagers making $100,000 a year, migrants, illegal migrants, senior, like I love the idea of people making as much money as they can. I have no problem with money. I make good money. Most of the people I associate with make good money. I try to share tips here on my channel. But as a small business owner, if you force Obamacare on me and retirement planning on me and minimum wage that is way above the national average, my company collapses. And
Yes.
a lot of companies would feel that. What's your thought on a $100,000 a year minimum wage?
Well, you're completely right. And I would add to it in the following way. It just shows you how off the rails they've gone. Because if you actually look at what she said that in the context of a Senate debate, she's running for Senate. And if you look at what the way she talked about it, she started from a position of truth, which is there's an affordability crisis. The cost of living in California is completely astronomical. So her response is, so we need a $50 minimum wage because it's so expensive to live here, rather than saying, well, hang on a second, why is it so expensive to live here? Because of the far left policies that have increased the cost of everything. So you can see it very clearly, directly in terms of energy, for example, literally the taxes that they put, the tax on gas, making it by far the most expensive in the country. Small businesses particularly affected by that. The regulations around gas, which make it more expensive to refine here. So that's, and of course, that's a huge component of industry's costs, energy. So that's more expensive. All the green mandates make energy more expensive. Then you look at the other really big component of people's costs, housing. So whether you own your own home or whether you're renting, more expensive than anywhere else in the country. Why? Because of their regulations that they've put in. It costs over 4 times as much to build the exact same house with this or building with exactly the same floor plan in California than just across the border in Arizona or Nevada, because of a combination of environmental regulations and also lawsuits that are filed by, guess who? The unions. And I wanted to go back to the earlier point you made about the legislature. It's true that the legislature is responsible for a lot of this stuff, but the real point is who runs the legislature. It's actually, the more you look at every single policy issue in California, it really is the case that the state is run by the unions, the public sector unions. You saw that very clearly in relation to what happened in the pandemic, where we had the longest and the most extreme lockdowns and the worst damage to kids' opportunities as a result of that. But also the private sector, the construction industry unions. I mean, housing is an area I've spent a lot of time on. And when you look at why it is so expensive to live in California, and by the way, housing costs are the number one reason that people are leaving California. To actually look at and they are leaving in their droves. I mean, we lost a seat in Congress for the first time in our history because the population is declining so rapidly. And the projection is that we're going to lose 5 more seats by 2030. People are fleeing, and housing costs are the number one reason. So she's right that things are really expensive, but the answer is get rid of the stupid far left policies that have made everything so expensive. What she's talking about, which is, okay, let's put them in, that'll make everything more expensive. Because guess what? If you're having to pay $50 an hour, I mean, as Chef Andrew Gruel, who's a friend of mine, who's working with me on some policies on the business climate, he said, look, if you put that in a restaurant, a steak's going to cost $300 in California. It's just insane.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't the best at algebra in junior high, high school, or even college, but If you take one side of the equation and you double it or you quadruple it, the other side is going to go up. If suddenly everybody in America had their income double or quadruple, the prices are just going to double or
Of course.
quadruple. And we're right back to where we were. It's like, hey, let's just put a zero on everything. Okay, once you put a zero on everything, 100, 1,000, 100, it doesn't matter. It all increases, right? And another example of that is, California forced a $20 minimum wage for restaurant workers, and
Yeah.
now a lot of restaurants are going out of business. Or combo meals have gone from $9 to $18, and people are saying, hey, I'm all for people that work in restaurants making a livable wage, but I now can't afford to eat your food, so I'm just going to eat at home or
Yes.
at some other establishment. So we're kind of seeing these policies play out, and economically, again, I'm for everybody making as much money as they can, but when the government forces something, it usually ends up being bad. If you don't believe me, read Atlas Shrugged, and you'll get the whole picture of all of it. The government tried to control all the entrepreneurs; they walked away, and what happened? The country collapses when the government tries to force things. Um,
Yes. I mean, by the way, just on that, on the fast food thing, it's actually the legislation that implemented that $20 minimum wage for fast food is called the FAST Act, totally driven by the unions. The unions, basically wrote that legislation. And I mean, it's egregious. Not just that's the headline, the $20, but there's a whole bunch of other things that are just disastrous for that whole sector. For example, it's shifting the liability when you have a franchise model onto the from the I can't remember which area, the franchisee or the franchisor, I don't know which name, which is the right term to use, but basically it makes let's say McDonald's has a franchise operating its restaurants. Now McDonald's, the corporation, is responsible for every single tiny violation that may be carried out by the person who's running the franchise, which means that they're basically it's not worth operating in California. So I think before long you're going to see wholesale withdrawal of some of these companies from California.
yeah. Okay, let's jump across the ocean. Just this morning, breaking news was that Vladimir Putin's number one political rival, Alexei Navalny, he's an anti-government, anti-corruption leader. He ran against Vladimir Putin. So what did he do? He jailed him, he poisoned him, he tortured him, he put him in one of those awful Russian prisons, and now he has died. It's been announced that he has died. What are your thoughts on Vladimir Putin basically taking out his political rival in order to stay in power?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I saw the news first thing this morning, and I actually couldn't believe it. And it's a very weird emotion because, in one sense, this was entirely predictable and predicted, including by Navalny himself. So we shouldn't be surprised. This happens to all of Putin's enemies. That's been the story of the last 20 years or so. Um, so we shouldn't be surprised, but it still felt like a shock because there was something about Navalny's spirit and courage that really made me feel that he would triumph in the end. I just had this belief that one day, a bit like Nelson Mandela, he would lead Russia into an era of openness and democracy and freedom as he dreamed of. I really believed that. I felt that. And so it was such a shock, even though it shouldn't have been. I think that it is the hallmark of an authoritarian regime. I know that type of regime very well. My parents are Hungarian. Most of my family's still in Hungary. When I was a kid, we'd go back. I grew up in England, but we'd go back to Hungary every year, at least once, often twice, spend whole summers there and so on, when it was a communist country. And so I'm aware of what they're like. And they're ruthless, these regimes. And so even though, it's not, Russia today is not a communist country in the sense of, the government owning all the businesses and so on, it's exactly the same style. I mean, he grew up in the KGB, in the communist system, in the apparatus. So the authoritarianism, the totalitarianism, the sort of no tolerance of any kind of opposition or free speech or criticism of the regime, that is a hallmark of communist dictatorships that we saw right across Eastern Europe. And I saw very directly, I mean, just a silly story that captures that for me. I remember when I was I don't know, about 10 years old, something like that, walking in the town, our hometown, Szeged. It's on the south of Hungary, south east, and with my two cousins walking on the street. And I don't know, I was like mucking about, and I remember saying out loud or shouting or something that Kadar, János Kadar, was then the communist leader of Hungary, and I was saying Kadar, he's an idiot. Kadar's an idiot. I thought I was just mucking about. And then that night, my aunt took me to one side and she said, look, I know in England you can, because we lived in England, we were visiting. So I know in England you can say stuff like that, but you really can't say that here. Like your cousins could get in real trouble. She was a teacher at a school. She said, I could lose my job. So really, it's not funny. I always remembered that. And so that was just a stupid thing. You can't say something on the street. So that's what they're like. Putin is out of that model, communist dictatorship. And so this is how they behave. The one thing I would really do, I mean, look, it's still early in this story, and people, as we're having this conversation, people are still processing it and so on. But one thing I've heard a lot is people saying, well, and I think this is what Blinken said and others, which is this shows how weak and rotten Putin's regime really is, that they were so terrified of one guy in jail they had to kill him. I just don't agree with that. I mean, I'm afraid. I think it shows that he's just got total control of that country, utterly ruthless, so brazen. And so I think it doesn't, I don't see how this changes as long as Putin's alive.
Yeah, yeah. The thing that first jumped out at me was President Biden condemned this and said, Putin is an evil man, that he would go after his political enemy. And yet,
I know, yes.
We now know that there's collusion between the White House legal team and Fani Willis in Georgia. We know that there is collusion and secret meetings between the J6 committee and Fani Willis. We know that there was collusion between the White House and Jack Smith. And last I checked, they have a total of 700 years worth of jail time for Donald Trump. So I just find the hypocrisy absolutely insane for Biden to say Putin is a weak man. Anybody, a wicked man, anyone that would lock up their political enemy is evil. And he just outed himself as being evil.
I know, it's so hilarious. They have absolutely no self-awareness, but they do this the whole time. I mean, it's called projection, isn't it? They accuse you of the exact thing that they do. And you see it. I mean, it's really kind of, almost the hallmark of the Democrats and the left these days, that whatever they're yelling at you about, you can be sure that they're doing it themselves. I mean, I think it's yes, you're right. And I mean, just looking at the examples, I mean, in particular, I think the New York ones, where it's just so obvious that no one would be prosecuted for these things if they weren't a political rival. And you have, what's her name, Letitia James and Alvin Bragg running for office on a election promise, a political promise to get Trump, and then using the legal system to do it. It's so obvious what they're doing, and it's shameless and brazen. But I think that they're so consumed by their own self-righteousness in relation to Trump that they'll just never see the irony.
Yeah. The only thing I can think of, I have a lot of family members that are Democrat, and I love them. And so I try to put my brain into their body sometimes and see the world through their lens. The only thing I can think of with like Letitia James or Fani Willis or Alvin Braggs is they ran on this ticket of getting Trump, and then they're going after him. I just wonder if the voters are sitting back going, finally, a politician that keeps their word. Right? Like, they all lie and then they don't do what they say, and these people are. But then from our perspective, they're like, this is really wretched. Like, this is wicked. This is so wrong. But from their perspective, they may be thinking, finally, someone that keeps their word in politics.
Well, it's a very interesting point you raise, because it reminds me that increasingly, it seems to me on the left, it is all about politics, not policy for them. So they can't deliver on anything substantive in terms of, something that affects your life in a positive way, as we've seen with the border and we've talked about in relation to California. When they're actually in charge of stuff, it doesn't work. Like, things get worse. when you put Democrats in charge, and then you look at a state like Florida, and whatever you think of Ron DeSantis, when you have that kind of strong conservative leadership in place, things get better. Like things actually improve in people's lives. Whereas with the Democrats, it's almost as if the real world impact of their stuff is just much less interesting to them than the politics, than sending the right message and pursuing the right enemies. And we used to call it virtue signaling, but it's not. I mean, there's nothing virtuous about it. It's ideology signaling. It's just saying, yeah, we stand with you. Like in California, there's so much that's put out in terms of legislation that's clearly not designed to solve a problem, that is there to send a message to the activists or whatever. And that's exactly what you're seeing with these legal cases as well. But it's part of this story, I think, where the Democrats are just really lost interest in sort of solid common sense governance and policy that makes people's lives better. And it's just all about politics.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've got a podcast out that is growing and getting attention, The Steve Hilton Show. Tell us a little bit about the show, and then where can I send people to follow you online?
Well, thank you. So the Steve Hilton Show, we do an episode a week, and so I actually, just the background to this is that I used to do a show on Fox News on Sunday nights, The Next Revolution, which I greatly enjoyed doing. But actually, as I'm now getting more involved in politics in California, it was time to move on to really focus on that. And so I'm spending a lot of my time now on the road, up and down California, fighting for the changes that I think we need to see. I'm still with Fox as a contributor, but I still wanted that kind of opportunity to, comment on the news of the day and the week and so on. So that's really what we do on the Steve Hilton Show. So it's once a week. It's the big story of the week. I talk about that. We usually try and do a policy story and focus in a bit more detail. Funnily enough, this week that's why I was able quickly to respond to your point about Barbara Lee's $50 an hour minimum wage, because it enabled me to do a whole piece on the affordability crisis in California and how this is exactly the wrong idea. We also do, we interview candidates, which I think is interesting, because so often candidates running, especially for state legislature and so on, and they're really important elections. We all focus on the presidential election, but these legislative elections, or for example, here's a good example. So there's a guy called Alex Villanueva, who people may have heard of. He was sheriff of Los Angeles County. He's a Democrat, but he was very much stood up against George Gascon, the far left Soros-backed DA, who's caused an absolute mayhem in LA. So Alex Villanueva is now running for the Board of Supervisors for Los Angeles County. And people may think, well, that's a kind of boring election, Board of Supervisors. It's 10 million people. The budget is $70 billion. It affects, health services, welfare, you name it. So if you live in Los Angeles County, which is the biggest county in America, 10 million people, actually those elections are the ones that will make most difference to your life. And so we try and give a platform to people like Alex, who are running for office. We have a candidate that we feature. And I talk about California because that's my focus. But the Steve Hilton Show, check it out. It's good fun. I always enjoy it. And I think our audience will too.
Great. Okay. I'll make sure to put a link down below to that. Guys, if you like this content, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button. Steve Hilton, thank you so much for coming on. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Of course. It's a great pleasure. Thanks so much.